So just for those who aren't familiar with these debates, which in the policy circles, as you're very familiar with, are quite common, the question is whether radicalization is caused by foreign policy grievances, and therefore do we need to change our foreign policy, or is it caused by, say, ideology and something else entirely, and therefore we need to address ideology. And what I say is that human beings react to circumstances differently. We're not all the same. We're social animals. We're not like water. We don't all boil at 100 degrees Celsius, and we don't all freeze at 0. And so, actually, the best way to explain this is it's usually radicalization is due to a combination of factors. There are 4 factors I name in the dialogue with Sam. I talk about grievances having a role in that. If somebody's not angry, they're not going to look for an alternative form of discourse in the first place. So there needs to be an anger there. So there's an element that the grievances play a role. Then there's an identity crisis that comes about. Then there's a charismatic recruiter as a third factor. And the fourth is the role that the ideology plays. But this overly simplistic view that because I'm angry at US foreign policy, it means I'm going to blow something up, is a terrible, terrible racism of low expectations of Muslims. It assumes that a brown young Muslim man, because he can't handle his anger, is just going to blow something up. It's a terrible explanation for what's going on. And actually, Islamists promote it because they want US foreign policy to change. They tell us that all the time. Bin Laden's speeches were all about changing policy towards the Middle East because he wanted to stop the support for Arab regimes so that he could overthrow them, as happened, eventually with the Arab uprising. So it's no surprise Islamists peddle this myth, but it's actually particularly worrying when those on my own political biases, the political center to center left, peddle this myth. Because the problem I have with it is the following. Look, I opposed the invasion of Iraq from a jail cell in Egypt. I've always been opposed to the Bush Jr.-led invasion of Iraq. But what I can't do is say that that's the reason ISIS exists. Of course, there's a contributing factor. We can't say that it's got nothing to do with it. But what I can't say is that that's the reason, that's the cause. Because if you think about it, you follow that logic through, why on earth are ISIS enslaving and raping Yazidi women en masse? What did these poor Yazidis do to anyone, anywhere? Which country did they invade? Or if you go to Afghanistan and look at the Taliban, what is forcing a man to grow a beard at the end of a lash of a whip, or forcing a woman to cover her face and her entire head, or stoning her to death because she's holding hands with the wrong person? What does any of that have to do with any invasion of any country? So there's something a bit more going on here, and it's too simplistic just to put all the blame on foreign policy mistakes. And of course, America, when it intervened in Kosovo to save the lives of Muslims, never got the credit for that. So it's a very simplistic worldview, and it needs to be challenged.
Sam, picking up on Majid's point, for a well-known atheist, why are you engaging in this conversation? I mean, what is it that would be, let's say I know you're not in politics, but that you would want to see change because of this conversation? Or is it just a good conversation to have?
Well, I think this is the political and ethical problem of our time. I mean, in the largest, most generic sense, I think the contest between good ideas and bad ideas, and the contest between good methodologies at arriving at ideas and bad ones, I think that is the most distinction to get right, both personally and at the level of societies. And religion at this moment has a monopoly on being able to promulgate bad ideas without the usual collisions with clear-thinking people in the world. There's a taboo against criticizing bad thinking, illogical thinking, false claims to evidence, false claims to knowledge. And I think this has just a destabilizing effect on human cooperation in general, because all we have is a choice between conversation and violence when things really matter. And when you're telling me that there's certain things you know to be true, but the way you know them is not based on any kind of publicly available mode of evidence or reasoning, and these things are not only non-negotiable, they're the most important principles in your life, this is intrinsically divisive. And this worries me across the board with all religion, but with certain religions, their commitments don't matter all that much. The fact that Jains won't kill animals and are rather dogmatic vegetarians, that's not a problem for anyone. And we're not going to see Jain terrorists insofar as they are. And this is why fundamentalism is a term of art and a red herring. The fundamentalism is not a problem if the fundamentals of your religion are totally benign. The crazier you get as a Jain, the less anyone has to worry about you. And that is rather obviously not true of Islam as a religion, nor is it true of many other religions. But Islam has a few variables that we've just touched on briefly that are uniquely problematic. And if I could just touch on this notion of grievance that Majid just discussed, I think we also have to admit that certain grievances really are just born of religion. They really are just theological. Mm-hmm. And if you push back hard enough on the theology, discredit the theology, that is what you need to do to contain the risk born of these grievances. And so, drawing cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if I took out a piece of paper now and drew a cartoon, a stick figure, and said, "This is Muhammad," it's not implausible to worry that the rest of my life will just be this deranged attempt not to be killed by some religious maniac who thinks I have crossed a line there. There's only one religion on earth today that is doing that to people, and this is not based on U.S. foreign policy. It's not based on anything other than specific religious ideas. And that what liberals have, where liberals have grown confused on this topic is they think there's some tension between free speech and freedom of religion, whereas there's not. If your free exercise of your religion requires that I follow its precepts, that's not freedom of religion. That is theocracy. So, and there's nothing I could say on this stage tonight that infringes upon anyone's freedom of religion. There's nothing. People have the political freedom to practice whatever faith they want in this country, and we all, as just sane participants in a civil society, have to recognize that all of these religious ideas have to be on the table to be criticized, mocked, satirized, and that has to be the line between free speech and its erosion. That, for me, is the most crucial line to be very clear about.
Why do you get so upset by people who believe in God, Richard?
I don't really get that upset. I mean, I'm a passionate believer in the truth, and the truth means the scientific truth about the real world. And so I do get a little bit impatient with people who substitute beliefs which are not based upon evidence, not based upon any reasonable view of what might be true about the real world, but are based instead on tradition and holy books and authority and revelation, things like that. When
did you become an atheist? Because you actually went to an Anglican school.
Most people in England in my generation went to Anglican schools, and I was no exception. I suppose I started to get uneasy about it at the age of about 9, when I realized there are lots of different religions. They can't all be right. It was just a pure accident that I happened to be brought up in a Christian country.
What do you mean they can't all be right? Because they all believe in one single God, the basic religions, Islam, Judaism and Christianity.
But they kill each other, don't they?
But they all believe in one supreme concept of God.
Hindus believe in millions of gods.
Yes, but I meant those three ones.
Ancient Greeks believe in hundreds of gods and so on.
Okay, so at 9 you thought they can't all be true.
They can't all be right. I realized it was an accident that I happened to have been brought up in a Christian country. But then at about 15, I had pretty much given up Christianity, but I still believed in some sort of vague design principle. And then I learned about evolution and Darwin and realized that there was really absolutely no reason to believe in any kind of supernatural things, and so I gave it up completely at that point.
How influential do you think your parents' thinking was? Because they were interested in science, weren't they? Natural science.
My father, who's just died, was educated in science, and my mother too is, well, she's still alive. She is interested in scientific things, interested in the natural world, and so I had a pretty good scientific upbringing from my parents, and at school, and above all at Oxford.
And why can't you just leave religion, though, in the sort of private domain? Because there are lots of people all over the world who, one way or another, might be suffering and so on, and they may need the invisible means of support.
Yeah. I'd love to leave it in the private domain. The trouble is that that isn't what happens, is it? And we have 26 bishops in the House of Lords. We have government-supported faith schools. We have people going to war over religion, killing over religion, suicide bombing over religion. The religious people do not keep it to themselves. They do impose it upon the rest of us, and therefore it's not a question of live and let live. I'd be happy to live and let live if that's what the majority of religious people do.
And do you think that if the people, population at large, the public at large, were to have a better understanding of science, that they'd all become atheists like you?
Not all, but a very substantial number would, yes.
But why do you think that?
Well, if you look at, for example, the National Academy of Sciences in America or the Royal Society in Britain, which are both elite bodies of scientists, about 90% of both those bodies are atheist or are non-believers. And so it looks as though, and there's plenty of other evidence, that the more educated you are in science, the less likely you are to believe in anything supernatural.
But there are very eminent scientists. I mean, even here in the UK, say Robert Winston, who is a committed Jew and yet is a scientist.
Yeah, ask them very carefully what they believe in. There are some who really do believe in virgin birth and things like that. But usually you'll find they believe in some sort of, it's rather a good thing that people should believe in religion. Even if they don't, they sort of vaguely support religion. Or they believe in some sort of vague great spirit that lies at the base of the universe or something. It's very seldom that if you actually pin them down, they really truly believe in miracles and that sort of thing.
Anybody who has children or who believes that they're doing something important in this world, or who works in difficult circumstances to bring water to villages or food to hungry people, would say that the idea that you could scientifically demonstrate a good life is worse than empty. It's a mockery.
Okay, well that's good. I see that the term happiness is a little too effete to capture what I'm after here. I'm talking about well-being. I'm talking about all of the factors that we recognize that correspond to the good life. And I'm certainly open to the possibility that we have yet to fully characterize the good life religiously, philosophically, and certainly scientifically. I mean, this is an open conversation. The question is, do you ever have to believe anything on insufficient evidence to explore this terrain, to become truly...
and what is sufficient evidence?
Well, it's the kind of evidence everyone in this room demands on any subject other than religion. I mean, there are nuances here. It takes a lot of work to rise to the standard of scientific evidence, but science is the one language game we are playing where we get really straight and rigorous about what constitutes evidence, where there's a process of peer review, where you have a lot of smart people trying to prove you wrong, and where you actually win points by proving yourself wrong. I mean, this is not what religions are up to. Religions are not falsifiable in this way. And I think you used a phrase that I thought was very useful to frame this. You talked about what used to be and what must be, I think was your phrase. And I think we should reflect on what used to be, because our religions come to us out of a tradition, in many cases, of human sacrifice. I mean, a human sacrifice was virtually a cultural universal. This is where we come from. These are the roots of religion. It's been by no means rare for a child to be born into this world, only to find that he's being raised by religious maniacs who think that the best way to keep the sun on its course or to cure the king's venereal disease is to bury or butcher or burn him alive as an offering to an imaginary god. This is not just the Aztecs. This is the ancient Hebrews. Human sacrifice is in the Hebrew Bible, at times condemned, at times tacitly supported, at times demanded, and then, as you know in the story of Abraham, the demand is recanted. We come from generations of people who did not know a damn thing about the causes of events in the world that really concern them. The spread of disease, the failure of crops, the weather. And so religious discourse has changed. We're not sacrificing people happily now, but it has changed by virtue of progress from the outside. I mean, just certain modes of operation are no longer tenable. When you can get a weather report on the evening news, you no longer have to sacrifice a child in a vain attempt to control the weather.
I should have mentioned Senator Schumer's book is called Positively American. In the personal story segment tonight, do you believe in God? Increasingly, fewer Americans do. According to a Pew poll, 12% of us do not have a belief in a higher power, up from 8% in 1987, and that group includes agnostics. In Europe, the rise of atheism and of Gnosticism is stunning. According to a Zuckerman study, in Sweden, as many as 85% of the population are non-believers. Japan, 65%. France, 54%. And in Britain, 44% do not believe in God in Great Britain. Listen now is a man who understands that position. Richard Dawkins, the author of the mega-selling best book, The God Delusion. I think it takes more faith to be like you, an atheist, than like me, a believer, and it's because of nature. You know, I just don't think we could have lucked out to have the tides come in, the tides go out, sun go up, sun go down. Don't think it could have happened.
We have a very full understanding of why the tides go in, the tides go out, of why the continents drift about, of why life is there. Science is ever more piling on the evidence, piling on the understanding.
But it had to get there. I understand that you know, the physiology of it, if you will, but it had to come from somewhere. And that is the leap of faith that you guys make, that it just happened.
Well, a leap of faith, you don't actually need a leap of faith. You're the one who needs a leap of faith because you are actually, the onus is on you to say why you believe in something. There's an infinite number of gods you could believe in. I take it you don't believe in Zeus or Apollo or Thor. You believe in, presumably, the Christian God, Jesus.
See, Jesus was a real guy. I could see him.
Yeah.
You know, and I know what he did. And so I'm not positive that Jesus is God, but I'm throwing in with Jesus rather than throwing in with you guys, because you guys can't tell me how it all got here. You guys don't know.
We're working on it. Physicists are working.
When you get it, then maybe I'll listen.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, if you look at the history of science over the centuries,
yeah,
the amount that's gained in knowledge each century is stupendous. In the beginning of the 21st century, we don't know everything. We have to be humble. We have to, in humility, say that there's a lot that we still don't know.
And, you know, being humble is a Christian virtue.
Well,
so there you go.
Of course it is.
All right, when you guys figure it out, then you come back here and tell me, because until that time, I'm sticking with Judeo-Christian philosophy and my religion of Roman Catholicism because it helps me as a person.
Ah, that's different. If it helps you, that's
absolutely.
great.
And
but that doesn't mean it's true.
Well, it's true for me. You see, I believe.
You mean true for you is different from true for anybody else? How can something be
absolutely,
true for you?
because I can't
Something's either got to be true or not.
I can't. No. I can't prove to you that Jesus is God. So that truth is mine and mine alone. But you can't prove to me that Jesus is not. So you have to stay in your little belief system.
You can't prove that Zeus is not. You can't prove that Apollo is not. Or
I saw Apollo, man. He was down there. He's not looking good. Now, we also differ in the sense that you feel that religion has been a bane, B-A-N-E, to civilization, and I feel atheism has. And I will point to the worst mass murderers in modern times: Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot. All confirmed atheists, all people who wanted to wipe out religion. Now, I know you can point to the Crusades and you can point to Al-Qaeda right now. I mean, it's there, and there's no question. But I say I'm thrown in with the founding fathers of the United States, which saw religion, spirituality as a moderating influence, as a good thing if people embrace the true tenets. Go ahead.
The founding fathers of the United States were secularists above all. So some of them were religious, some of them were not, but they were above all secularists who believed in keeping church and state
They
separate.
had to because of the oppression in Europe.
That was what they were,
right.
Precisely.
But
I mean, that was
almost
what they were doing.
all of them, they all said a prayer before their deliberations. In their letters, and I have almost all their letters, they all reference the deity. Our Declaration of Independence references heavily. But they saw it as a moderating influence because the federal government at that point couldn't control the country. And they said, you know, if people follow Jesus, then the country's going to be better.
It may well be a moderating influence. As for Hitler and Stalin and so on, I mean, of course, Hitler, by the way, was a Roman Catholic.
No, he never was. He was raised in that home,
yeah, well,
but he rejected it early on.
We can dispute that. Stalin was an atheist, no question. But Stalin did the bad things he did, not because he was an atheist. I mean, Hitler and Stalin both had moustaches, but we don't say it was their moustaches that made them evil.
I don't think they had any moral foundation, any of those guys. I will say,
I don't either.
Your book is fascinating, and congratulations on your success. Thanks for coming on in here.
1 month ago, the celebrated atheist, author, and neuroscientist Sam Harris appeared on Real-Time, Bill Maher's HBO show. The conversation about Islam that ensued created quite a bit of controversy. Harris said, among other things, that, quote, Islam at this moment is the motherlode of bad ideas, unquote. He went on to say that more than 20% of Muslims are either jihadists or Islamists who want to foist their religion on the rest of humanity. That comes out to about 300 million people. I beg to differ and said as much when I responded with my own thoughts on the show. But I wanted to talk to Mr. Harris in person, so here he is. He's the author of a new book, Waking Up, and we might get to it. Yes. But first I want to ask you about that number, which sure. It struck me you sort of pulled out of a hat. If you do have, something in the range of 20% of all Muslims who are either jihadists or Islamists, and which implies condoning violence and such, I'm just doing the math. That comes to about 300 million.
Right.
So there were 10,000 terrorist events last year. Let's assume that 100 people, let's assume all of those were Muslim. Let's assume each event was planned by 100 people. Neither of those assumptions is right, but I'm being generous. Right. That comes to about 1 million people who are jihadists. So that still leaves us with 299 million missing Muslim terrorists.
Right. Well, there are a few distinctions I think we have to make here. One is there's a difference between a jihadist and an Islamist. And there I was talking about Islamists and jihadists together. And so Islamists are people who want to foist their interpretation of Islam on the rest of society. And sometimes they have a revolutionary bent, sometimes they have a more of a normal political bent. But they do want to...
The fact that somebody may believe that, for example, Sharia should obtain and women's testimony should be worth half a man's in court doesn't mean that they want to kill people. Right?
Well, no.
Those are two. Being conservative and religious, which, by the way, is not my orientation at all, but it's different from wanting to kill people.
Yes, yeah. Well, we should, again, you have to parse this on specific points, like do you favor killing apostates? Do you think adulterers should be killed? And even among Islamists, you'd find more subscribing to one versus the other, depending on the poll you trust. But I didn't just pull the number out of a hat. I mean, there's a group at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, that looked at 40 years of parliamentary elections in the Muslim world, literally every election that has occurred, and found that Islamists got 15% of the votes. So I would say that when you take this number 15% who vote for Islamist parties, and then you look at the poll results on specific implementation of Sharia law, so do you want adulterers and thieves given the traditional punishments, or should apostates be killed? You never find the number, with very few exceptions, you never find the number as low as 15% voting in favor of those punishments. It's often 60%, depending on the society. So I believe nudging that up to something around 20% is still a conservative estimate of the percentage of Muslims worldwide who have values relating to human rights and free speech that are really in zero-sum contest with our own. And I just think we have to speak honestly about that.
Clearly, Islam has a problem today, but there have been periods when Islam was at the vanguard of modernity. It was the place that preserved Aristotle and preserved science. So if it was Islam that was the problem, how come it was okay then? In other words, that would suggest that it is the social and political conditions within Muslim societies or the people now. In other words, clearly Islam has been compatible with peace and progress, and it is compatible with violence, I would argue, just like all religions.
Yeah, well, up to a point. I would say that specific ideas have specific consequences. And the idea of jihad is not a new one. It's not an invention of the 20th century. And many people are now spreading a very PC and sanitized history of religious conflict. Islam has been spread by the sword for over 1,000 years. And yes, there's been an intensification, and for obvious political reasons, of intolerance in the 20th century. But the idea that life for Christians and Jews as dhimmi under Muslim rulers for 1,000 years was good doesn't make any sense. And certainly life for Jews, when you,
wait a second,
you compare it to medieval Christendom, then, okay, it might
But that was the main alternative. I mean, that's why when the Jews left Spain and were expelled, they went to the place that they thought was most hospitable to them, which was the Ottoman Empire, which was the Caliphate, right?
I criticize Christianity as much as anyone. I wrote a book, Letter to a Christian Nation, which is just a vilification of the history of Christianity, the influence of the beliefs in the modern world.
And I would have thought, having written that book, you would recognize that there are elements of Christianity that, as you point out in that book, are compatible with and celebrate slavery and violence and all these very, very backward attitudes. And yet there are times when Christianity represented that, and at times when it has represented peace and modernity.
Okay, right? But there's a few things we have to distinguish here. One is specific ideas have specific consequences. So when you ask why Jews aren't living out of Leviticus and Deuteronomy anymore, and they're not sanctioning genocide, they're not sanctioning killing people for working on the Sabbath, there are several answers to that question. One is that there's no Sanhedrin, but the fact that they don't have a Sanhedrin
Explain what a Sanhedrin is.
It's a consecrated body of elders in the community that can judge whether or not somebody should be killed for working on the Sabbath. So the details matter, and one of the details here is that a belief that in Islam that the one true faith has to conquer the world through jihad, essentially, and that free speech.
But jihad means different things in different people.
Again, it does. I agree with you that we have to convince the Muslim world, or get the Muslim world to convince itself, that jihad really just means an inner spiritual struggle. That is the end game for civilization. Right. But the reality is, an honest reading of the text and an honest reading of Muslim history makes jihad look very much like holy war.
So in that sense, the problem is you and Osama bin Laden agree. Because after all, you're saying his interpretation of Islam is correct.
Well, this is the problem. His interpretation of Islam is very straightforward and honest, and you really have to split hairs and do some interpretive acrobatics in order to get it to look non-canonical.
But do you really think that the path to reforming Islam is to tell Muslims that their religion is the motherlode of bad ideas, that they should become atheists or symbolic followers, or nominal, I think was the word used, nominal followers? I mean, do you really think that 1.6 billion devout Muslims are going to go, oh, damn, of course, Sam Harris is right, my religion is crap, and I should just abandon it?
No. Well, I slightly misspoke there. I didn't mean nominal followers in the sense that only Muslim atheists could reform the faith. What I meant is followers who don't take these specific dangerous beliefs very seriously and want to interpret jihad as an inner spiritual struggle as opposed to holy war.
But do you think you're helping them, or you're making it harder for them by as I said, adopting the Osama bin Laden interpretation?
I'll tell you who's making it harder for them. Liberals who deny the problem. I get emails every day from atheists and secularists living in the Muslim world who say, I can't
forget about others.
Well, I'm telling you. I'm telling you the only metric I have for that is I hear from people living in Pakistan, for instance, who say, if a liberal like you can't even speak honestly about the link between ideology and violence, what hope is there for me? I can't even tell my mother what I believe about God because I would be afraid of my own family or village killing me.
Sam Harris, thank you very much.
Well, that was all very interesting. Ask yourselves, what is wrong with spending eternity in hell? Well, I'm told it's rather hot there, for one. Dr. Craig is not offering an alternative view of morality. Okay, the whole point of Christianity, or so it is imagined, is to safeguard the eternal well-being of human souls. Now, happily, there's absolutely no evidence that the Christian hell exists. Okay, and I think we should look at the consequences of believing in this framework, this theistic framework, in this world, and what these moral underpinnings actually would be. All right. 9 million children die every year before they reach the age of 5. Okay, picture an Asian tsunami of the sort we saw in 2004 that killed 250,000 people. One of those every 10 days, killing children only under 5. Okay, it's 24,000 children a day, 1,000 an hour, 17 or so a minute. That means before I can get to the end of this sentence, some few children, very likely, will have died in terror and agony. Think of the parents of these children. Think of the fact that most of these men and women believe in God and are praying at this moment for their children to be spared. And their prayers will not be answered. Okay, but according to Dr. Craig, this is all part of God's plan. Any God who would allow children by the millions to suffer and die in this way, and their parents to grieve in this way, either can do nothing to help them or doesn't care to. He is therefore either impotent or evil. And worse than that, on Dr. Craig's view, most of these people, many of these people certainly, will be going to hell because they're praying to the wrong God. Just think about that. Okay, through no fault of their own, they were born into the wrong culture where they got the wrong theology and they missed the revelation. Okay, there are 1.2 billion people in India at this moment. Most of them are Hindus, most of them therefore polytheists. Okay, in Dr. Craig's universe, no matter how good these people are, they are doomed. If you are praying to the monkey god Hanuman, you are doomed. You will be tortured in hell for eternity. Now, is there the slightest evidence for this? No. It just says so in Mark 9 and Matthew 13 and Revelation 14. Okay, perhaps you'll remember from the Lord of the Rings, it says when the elves die, they go to Valinor, but they can be reborn in Middle-earth. I say that just as a point of comparison. Okay, so God created the cultural isolation of the Hindus. Okay, he engineered the circumstance of their deaths in ignorance of revelation. And then he created the penalty for this ignorance, which is an eternity of conscious torment in fire. Okay, on the other hand, on Dr. Craig's account, your run-of-the-mill serial killer in America, okay, who spent his life raping and torturing children, need only come to God, come to Jesus on death row, and after a final meal of fried chicken, he's going to spend an eternity in heaven after death. Okay, one thing should be crystal clear to you. This vision of life has absolutely nothing to do with moral accountability. Okay, and please notice the double standard that people like Dr. Craig use to exonerate God from all this evil. Okay, we're told that God is loving and kind and just and intrinsically good. But when someone like myself points out the rather obvious and compelling evidence that God is cruel and unjust because he visits suffering on innocent people of a scope and scale that would embarrass the most ambitious psychopath, okay, we're told that God is mysterious. Okay, who can understand God's will? Okay, and yet this is precisely this merely human understanding of God's will is precisely what believers use to establish his goodness in the first place. You know, something good happens to a Christian. He feels some bliss while praying, say, or he sees some positive change in his life, and we're told that God is good. Okay, but when children by the tens of thousands are torn from their parents' arms and drowned, we're told that God is mysterious. Okay, this is how you play tennis without the net. Okay, and I want to suggest to you that it is not only tiresome when otherwise intelligent people speak this way, it is morally reprehensible. Okay, this kind of faith is really the perfection of narcissism. I mean, God loves me, don't you know? He cured me of my eczema. He makes me feel so good while singing in church. And just when we had given up hope, he found a banker who was willing to reduce my mother's mortgage. Okay, given all that this God of yours does not accomplish in the lives of others, given the misery that's being imposed on some helpless child at this instant, this kind of faith is obscene. Okay, to think in this way is to fail to reason honestly or to care sufficiently about the suffering of other human beings.
And if God is good and loving and just and kind, and he wanted to guide us morally with a book, why give us a book that supports slavery? Why give us a book that admonishes us to kill people for imaginary crimes like witchcraft? Now, of course, there's a way of not taking these questions to heart. Okay, according to Dr. Craig's divine command theory, God is not bound by moral duties. God doesn't have to be good. Whatever he commands is good. So when he commands that the Israelites to slaughter the Amalekites, that behavior becomes intrinsically good because he commanded it. Okay, well, here we're being offered, I'm glad he raised the issue of psychopathy, we're being offered a psychopathic and psychotic moral attitude. It's psychotic because this is completely delusional. There's no reason to believe that we live in a universe ruled by an invisible monster, Yahweh. But it is psychopathic because this is a total detachment from the well-being of human beings. This so easily rationalizes the slaughter of children. Okay, just think about the Muslims at this moment who are blowing themselves up, okay, convinced that they are agents of God's will. There is absolutely nothing that Dr. Craig can say against their behavior in moral terms, apart from his own faith-based claim that they're praying to the wrong God. Okay, if they had the right God, what they were doing would be good on divine command theory. Now, I'm obviously not saying that Dr. Craig or all religious people are psychopaths and psychotics, but this, to me, is the true horror of religion. Okay, it allows perfectly decent and sane people to believe by the billions what only lunatics could believe on their own. Okay, if you wake up tomorrow morning thinking that saying a few Latin words over your pancakes is going to turn them into the body of Elvis Presley, okay, you have lost your mind. Okay? But if you think more or less the same thing about a cracker and the body of Jesus, you're just a Catholic. And I'm not the first person to notice that it's a very strange sort of loving God who would make salvation depend on believing in him on bad evidence. Okay, I mean, if you lived 2,000 years ago, there was evidence galore. I mean, he was just performing miracles. But apparently he got tired of being so helpful. Okay, and so now we all inherit this very heavy burden of the doctrine's implausibility. And the effort to square it with what we now know about the cosmos and what we know about the all-too-human origins of Scripture becomes more and more difficult. Okay, and it's not just the generic God that Dr. Craig is recommending. It is God the Father and Jesus the Son. Okay, Christianity, on Dr. Craig's account, is the true moral wealth of the world. Well, I hate to break it to you here at Notre Dame, but Christianity is a cult of human sacrifice. Okay, Christianity is not a religion that repudiates human sacrifice. It is a religion that celebrates a single human sacrifice as though it were effective. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, John 3:16. Okay, the idea is that Jesus suffered the crucifixion so that none need suffer hell, except those billions in India and billions like them throughout history. Okay, this is astride. This doctrine is astride a contemptible history of scientific ignorance and religious barbarism. We come from people who used to bury children under the foundations of new buildings as offerings to their imaginary gods. I mean, just think about that. In vast numbers of societies, people would bury children in post holes, people like ourselves thinking that this would prevent an invisible being from knocking down their buildings. Okay. These are the sorts of people who wrote the Bible. Okay. If there is a less moral framework than the one Dr. Craig is proposing, I haven't heard of it.
So those are the kinds of different factors. People that score high in internal locus of control versus external locus of control tend to see more patterns, tend to see fewer random patterns as meaningful. That is, if you believe that you are more in control of your environment, you're less likely to see random patterns as meaningful. If you tend to believe that the world sort of controls your life, and that's called external locus of control, you're more likely to see random patterns as real. We know if you put subjects in environments in which they feel unstable or uncertain or anxious, people that are about to jump out of a plane with a parachute, perfect sample for this, and they've done this experiment. So people that are just about to jump out of a plane, they show them these random patterns, they're much more likely to see meaningful patterns in the dots than those who are just sitting on the ground. There's a whole series of these sorts of things. We know this from the study of the Trobriand Islanders by the anthropologist Malinowski in his famous book, Science and Magic, in the 1930s, that whenever they went fishing, the further out to sea they went, and the more precarious and uncertain the catch was, and the whole process of fishing that was dangerous at deep sea fishing, the more superstitious, magical talismans and behaviors they had. The closer to the shore, the safer it was, the fewer superstitions they had. You have to look no further than Yankee Stadium to see this at work in baseball players who are very superstitious. When they're batting, the same people are not very superstitious when they're fielding. Fielders tend to be very successful. 90-95% is pretty typical. Batters fail 7 out of 10 times. If you fail 7 out of 10 times, you can still make the Hall of Fame. That's how hard it is to hit a baseball. So they are loaded with all kinds of superstitious behaviors. So we know it's related to control, anxiety, dopamine, right brain, so on. So this whole process of patternicity is built into our brains. Now, let's return to our thought experiment. You're a hominid in the plains of Africa 3.5 million years ago. You hear a rustle in the grass. What's the difference between just the wind and a dangerous predator? Well, the wind is an inanimate force. A dangerous predator is an intentional agent. So I call this agenticity, the tendency to infuse patterns with intentional agents. It's not just the wind. It's a thing, a being that intends, an agent that intends something, intends to eat me, and that's probably not good. So it's probably good to assume not only that the pattern is real, but it actually intends action that could influence me, right? So I call that agenticity, and this is, I think, is the basis for animism, the animistic belief that everything is alive, the trees, the rocks, the clouds, and so forth. Polytheism, monotheism, ghosts, gods, demons, angels, aliens, even extraterrestrials. They're always portrayed as like this, super force coming down to rescue us from nuclear war, global warming. Take your pick. These are all forms of agents that we infuse into the patterns we think we see. Now, and we do even more than that. I think animals actually do this. They don't have theory of mind like we have theory of mind, but they do make an assumption like that, at least something like that it's not just an inanimate force, it's something that intends me harm. They don't have language, they can't call it something, their cortex is too small to think about it, but they still act in response to it, and I think that's the basis of these beliefs that we hold. And then we do even more than that. We do mind read, we do project, I don't mean ESP, right? Like we know is not true, but that actually we project ourselves into somebody else's head and imagine what they're thinking. And then we do more than that. We're self-aware, we're aware that other people are self-aware, and I know that you know that I'm self-aware, and I know that you know that I know that you are and this sort of meta thing. So we do all this complex stuff. We're able to project ourselves out there. We also have a body schema in our mind. Oh, by the way, when I use the word mind, I'm using it metaphorically. There is no mind. There's just brain. And the mind is just a word to describe what the brain does. That's it. It's just one of these fuzzy words that people like Deepak love to use in describing that this is out there somewhere. It isn't. And as I told Deepak, I'm right, which of course he doesn't believe. Because when your brain gets damaged, stroke, injury, dementia, senility, and especially Alzheimer's, as the brain dies, the person disappears. The memories are going. The personality, who they were, is gone. And you can see it fade very slowly. My stepmom had this for 3 or 4 years. I could just watch her week by week and month by month just disappear. So as I asked Deepak a couple of months ago when we debated at Chapman University, You can watch this online. I asked him, where is Aunt Millie's mind when her brain dies from Alzheimer's, say? Where's Aunt Millie's mind? And by God, he had an answer. You want to know what it is? The Matrix. I said, wow, okay, where do I get that besides, Netflix? I mean, is there yes. So anyway, this is a whole nother story that I do discuss in The Believing Brain. That is, there's no such thing as the paranormal or the supernatural either. These are also just fuzzy words we use to describe something we don't understand. And eventually we'll either understand it just becomes part of the natural world, or it just disappears because it doesn't really exist and we quit thinking about it or quit experimenting with it because nobody could find any evidence for it. So, for example, even if Deepak is right he has this theory about quantum consciousness. He and Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose, they really glom on to Roger Penrose because he's a world-class Oxford physicist. He's the guy that co-authored with Stephen Hawking the whole theory about black holes and the entire universe is a black hole. Anyway, so he's a big name. And they have this idea that inside your neurons in your brain are these little microtubules. They're like scaffolding that holds your cells together. Actually, all cells have them, but neurons also have them. And they claim that inside these microtubules, you can get a collapse of the wave function. Okay, this is a quantum physics concept that has something to do with entanglement and spooky action at a distance, as Einstein called it, where you do something to one little subatomic particle over here, and it affects it over on the other side of the room in the experiment, or it could be on the other side of the city, it could be on the other side of the galaxy, and it will have an instantaneous effect. They're entangled somehow. Okay, anyway, this is weird quantum physics stuff that no one understands, and because Feynman said no one understands it, I take his word for it because he's a lot smarter than me, and I don't know anything about quantum physics. In any case, so their theory is that, let's say you're thinking certain thoughts, like I'm looking at the back of a playing card, or one of those Zener cards with the wavy lines, or the circle, or the triangle, or the plus sign, whatever, and I'm thinking about that thought, and you're supposed to read my thoughts, the ESP. So now, as I'm thinking about it, my neurons start to fire in a certain pattern, and they get kind of a little sequence of pattern going, and that causes these subatomic particles in the microtubules of my neurons to collapse in a certain pattern, and it leaves my skull because these things happen across the ether, whatever, and they go into your skull, and that causes your neurons to fire in the same pattern my neurons are firing, and then you read my mind. Okay, that's the theory. I don't believe it for a second. I don't think there's anything that even needs to be explained because no one actually can read people's minds under controlled conditions, or they can't successfully and repeatedly read the back of playing cards or anything like that. Nevertheless, let's just, for the thought experiment, say it's true. They can do it, and that's the explanation. Well, that would no longer be the paranormal. That would not be psi or ESP. That would just be quantum physics and neuroscience, or quantum consciousness, as Deepak calls it. It would just become a branch of physics and neuroscience. It would just become part of the natural world. So let's dispense with all that language, mind, paranormal, pseudo, whatever. Just forget all that. It's either it's science or it's nothing. It's just part of the natural world, or
Guys, today let's take a brief look at Exodus chapter 21 verses 20 to 21, where it says, anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. You know, the first time I read this verse, I missed the as a direct result part of the verse, which actually makes me wonder, let's say the victim had a code that led to them getting assaulted by their owner, and then later passes away. How would they determine what actually took away his life between the beating and the sickness? Or let's say the assaulter causes some internal damage that makes the victim's slave appear healed after a day or two, but then a week down the line falls dead out of nowhere. Does the assaulter still get punished in this case? Well, no, not man. But hey, what do I know? You know, maybe everything I'm parroting here is too advanced for an all-knowing God, and that's why he did not consider these caveats when giving his favorite ethnicity a whole pass for assaulting other human beings. And by the way, anytime you bring this verse and many others like it that can be found throughout the Bible, Christian apologists will usually acknowledge that these verses do clash with our modern values of equality, freedom, and human dignity. But in the defense of their all-knowing and all-loving God, they'll usually remind us that slavery was a widespread activity back in those days, and God in this instance was just trying to regulate an existing practice rather than endorse it. And as far as pathetic excuses go, man, this sure does take the crown in my opinion, which is something that I've pointed out multiple times in previous videos. And to prove just how pathetic the excuse is, I'll give you a list of things that were widespread back then, but the Bible still banned them and deemed them immoral and a sin. Listen to them and let me know what about them warranted an explicit ban that couldn't be extended to slavery, man. 1. Eating fat in Leviticus 3 verse 17, and 2. In chapter 19 verse 19 of the same book, you are prohibited from sowing your field with different kinds of seeds or wearing different kinds of cloth materials. And immediately the verse after that, the Bible says it's illegal for men to hook up with female slaves that belong to other people, and it's a crime / sin punishable by death. I'm not done actually. Deuteronomy 22 verses 20 to 21 states that any woman found not to be pure on her wedding night should be stoned to death at her father's house. Typical. Imagine that. Next, according to Leviticus 19 verse 27, shaving and trimming your beard is apparently also a sin. And even more interesting, ladies and gentlemen, according to Leviticus 10 verse 6, leaving your hair uncombed is not only a sin punishable by death, it could even result in the Lord's anger striking the whole community. And if you touch anything unclean, according to the same Bible in Leviticus chapter 5 verse 2, if you touch anything unclean, even if you're unaware of it, you're still guilty of sin, according to the verse. I can obviously do this all day, man, but you guys get the idea already. If the pro-slavery verses throughout the Bible are simply a way for God to best manage sin in a particular way at a particular time, then why are all the things I've listed above explicitly forbidden before the eyes of the Lord, and in most cases punishable by death, which is the ultimate sentence, man? They are all things that were rampant in society back then, just like slavery, but still they were illegal. Make it make sense, man. Anyway, this discussion on God's perception of slavery according to the Bible would have been complete without this other verse, Leviticus 25 verses 44 to 46. Here, the Bible says, your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become a property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Yeah, our all-knowing God wouldn't even show mercy to children within the Israeli society that had been born by immigrants in the nation. But at least he was gracious enough to remind the people that they should never rule over their chosen fellows, counterparts, ruthlessly, man. So, does that really sound to you like a message from a fair and loving God who wants to regulate an already rampant practice in human culture? Does it sound like a blueprint for establishing certain ethnicities as inherently superior to others? Imagine being allowed to enslave all foreigners, including those who have lived among you since forever, but you must treat your fellow chosen ones better. These three verses are quite literally the perfect sum up of the desires of the hooded fools running across Southern America, man. But Christians really expect us to believe that they're inspired by a being that cares about everyone. I was born at night, man, but I wasn't born last night. Now, let's close up the video with one that was quite new to me, and I couldn't believe what I was reading when I decided to read the Bible over again with fresh intentions, you know, to really deduce the truth about the nature of our all-loving God. In this verse, God basically threatens his people with grape and then takes credit for it. Now, like you, most people might not remember this verse, especially if they were used to reading the KJV version of the Bible. That version of the Bible brilliantly camouflaged the atrocious nature of the verse. And here it is, man. Let me read it. Jeremiah chapter 13, verses 15 to 26. Hear and give ear, do not be haughty, for the Lord has spoken. And if you say in your heart, why have these things come upon me? It is for the greatness of your iniquity that your skirts are lifted up and you are violated, because you have forgotten me and trusted in lies. I myself will lift up your skirts over your face, and your shame will be seen. Violate, needless to say, means grape in this verse, but I particularly love the Good News translation version of the Bible. It didn't leave anything to the imagination. The verse simply says, if you ask why all this has happened to you, why your clothes have been torn off and you have been graped, it is because your sin is so terrible. The whitewashed KJV, on the other hand, says, and it's quite complicated, let me read it, man, for you. And if thou say in thine heart, whereof come these things upon me, for the greatness of thine iniquity are thy skirts discovered, and thy heels made bare. If you ask me, man, this is pretty smart if your plan is to make sure a majority of your flock doesn't catch on or feel uncomfortable, man. Stay safe, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.